What if the most damaging moment of Prince Harry's return to Britain didn't happen inside a courtroom at all? Not under oath, not in front of a judge, not with reporters scribbling every word. What if it happened later, quietly, in a corridor no camera crew was meant to see? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That question has been sitting uncomfortably at the center of this story, and it's the reason this case feels different from every other royal legal drama we've watched play out over the years. Because on the surface, this looks like a familiar fight. Prince Harry, back in London, taking on the British press once again, accusing powerful media interests of crossing legal and ethical lines. A man who says he's standing up not just for himself, but for accountability, for privacy, for principle. And yet, there was a moment during this trip, brief, undocumented, and now heavily disputed, that has unsettled people who rarely admit to being unsettled. A moment that, if it happened the way multiple sources describe it, reframes the entire visit. Not as a simple legal return, not even as a symbolic one, but as something more tense, more personal, more volatile. Because here's the contradiction that's hard to ignore. Harry arrived in the UK as a litigant demanding transparency from others, while, allegedly, moving through the most secretive institution in Britain in near silence. That contradiction matters. And not historically, not in some abstract, long-ago sense. It matters now, because of timing, because of power, and because of what may have been quietly released in response. Let's slow this down. Officially, the reason for Harry's presence in London was clear. He was attending proceedings at the High Court as part of his ongoing lawsuit against Associated Newspapers, the publisher behind the Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday. The claim is serious, that journalists and private investigators, acting on behalf of the publisher, illegally obtained private information over a period of years. Phone hacking, surveillance, intrusion. Associated Newspapers, for its part, has vigorously denied the allegations. And legally speaking, that denial is exactly where things are supposed to stand until a court decides otherwise. So far, this is familiar ground. Harry has built much of his post-royal public identity around this battle with the British press. He has framed it as a moral crusade, a reckoning, a line in the sand drawn after what he describes as years of trauma inflicted not just on him, but on his wife, his children, and ultimately, on his mother before him. He has said, repeatedly, that this fight is about truth. And yet, during this particular visit, something about the atmosphere felt different. Journalists covering the court proceedings noticed it first. Not anything dramatic. No shouting. No outbursts. Just a subtle shift. Harry appeared controlled, composed, but there was an edge there. A tension that didn't quite match the procedural calm of the courtroom. Long pauses before answers. Eyes lingering just a little too long on certain faces. The kind of body language that suggests someone is managing more than one situation at once. Is that unusual for a high-stakes legal case? Not necessarily. But here's where the story begins to bend. Because after the court adjourned, after the cameras followed the predictable routes, after most observers assumed the day's narrative was finished, there were movements that didn't fit the script. Security vehicles repositioning. Schedules adjusting without explanation. Gaps in the public timeline that were small enough to ignore, unless you were already paying attention. And some people were paying attention. Palace staff, according to multiple accounts, became aware of activity that raised internal questions. Not alarms, exactly, but questions. Questions about access, about permissions, about presence. Questions that, under normal circumstances, might have been dismissed as routine, except for one thing. Harry was not supposed to be there. Or at least, not there in that way. This is where the word sneaking enters the conversation, and it's important to be precise about that. No one is claiming a criminal act. No one is alleging a break-in. The language matters because it reveals more about perception than legality. What's being described is something subtler and, in some ways, more damaging, an appearance of secrecy, of moving through a space that carries immense symbolic weight without public acknowledgement. Buckingham Palace is not just a building. It is a symbol of continuity, authority, and control. Access is choreography. Every entrance, every exit, every step is managed, logged, and understood within a hierarchy that rarely tolerates improvisation. So when whispers began circulating that Harry had entered palace grounds after hours, quietly, briefly, and without the usual formal markers, it set off a chain reaction. Not because it was necessarily forbidden, but because it disrupted an unspoken understanding. And then came the rumor that changed the tone entirely, that there was footage, a video, not leaked by tabloids, not captured by a passerby, but held within the institutional framework itself. Security footage, unembellished, silent, the kind of recording that doesn't editorialize but also doesn't forget. Here's where things become genuinely uncomfortable, because according to several well-placed sources, that footage did not remain internal. It was, allegedly, released. Not broadly, not as a press spectacle, but deliberately, controlled, circulated in a way that ensured it would be seen by the people it needed to reach. And the claim, this is where accounts converge in strikingly similar ways, is that when Harry became aware of this, his reaction was immediate and unguarded. A visible flush of anger, a loss of composure that contrasted sharply with the disciplined demeanor he'd maintained in court. Why would that matter? Because reactions tell us where the pressure points are. They reveal what narratives we can manage, and which ones threaten to slip out of our control. If Harry believed his movements were private, even symbolically private, then the existence of footage reframes the entire visit. It suggests oversight where autonomy was assumed, observation where discretion was expected. And then there is the most sensitive question of all: who authorized the release? This is where King Charles III enters the story, not as a caricature, not as an antagonist, but as a man caught between roles that rarely align neatly. Father, monarch, custodian of an institution that survives by projecting stability, not vulnerability. There is no public confirmation that the king personally ordered anything. That distinction matters. But in institutions like the monarchy, authorization is often as much about silence as instruction. What is allowed to circulate? What is permitted to stand? What is quietly endorsed by not being stopped? And timing, in this case, is impossible to ignore. This alleged release did not happen randomly. It did not surface months later, detached from context. It coincided with Harry's legal challenge against the press, a challenge that positions him as a victim of invasive surveillance. Do you see the irony? A man suing newspapers for violating his privacy, confronted with evidence that he himself was being observed inside the very institution he once represented. That irony is sharp enough to cut through even the most carefully managed narrative. And it forces a question that neither side seems eager to answer directly. Is this about justice, or is it about leverage? Because if the footage exists, and again, we are being careful here, it doesn't just document a moment. It asserts a boundary. It reminds Harry, and perhaps the public, that some systems never stopped watching. That departure from royal duties did not mean departure from royal oversight. And if you're wondering why this hasn't been fully addressed in public statements, that may be the point. Silence can be strategic, especially when acknowledging something would give it weight it doesn't yet officially have. Still, the tension is there. You can feel it in the way palace sources speak cautiously, in the way legal teams redirect questions, in the way coverage focuses intensely on courtroom arguments while skirting what happened after dark. Stories like this don't explode immediately. They seep. They gather pressure. They wait for the right moment, or the wrong one. And we are still in the early stages, because the most disturbing possibility hasn't even been addressed yet. What if this wasn't the only recording? What if the video that caused such visible anger was merely a reminder, not a revelation, of how much is documented, archived, and retrievable within palace walls? And what happens if more of that documentation becomes relevant? That is where this story stops being about one man, one lawsuit, or even one family dispute. It becomes about power, memory, and who controls the narrative when private movement collides with public accountability. Harry came to London to confront the press, but he may have walked straight into a much quieter confrontation. One that doesn't argue in headlines or affidavits, but in images, timing, and implication. And if that confrontation has only just begun, then what comes next could change not just this case, but the fragile truce between a prince who left and an institution that never really let him go. So here's the question that hangs in the air as this story moves forward. If the confrontation didn't begin in the palace, where did it really start? Because long before anyone whispered about corridors and cameras, long before the idea of footage even surfaced, the stage had already been set in a very public place. A courtroom, cold wood, neutral walls, rules, procedures, the kind of environment where emotions are supposed to be flattened into facts. That's where Prince Harry officially returned to Britain. Not as a working royal, not as a prodigal son, but as a claimant. And that distinction matters more than it seems. The lawsuit that brought Harry back to London this time wasn't improvised or symbolic. It wasn't a press stunt. It was one thread in a long, complicated legal strategy aimed squarely at the British media establishment, specifically Associated Newspapers, the company behind the Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday. On paper, the case is technical, dense, almost boring if you strip away the names. Allegations of unlawful information gathering, claims of phone hacking, blagging, surveillance. Assertions that journalists, or those acting on their behalf, crossed legal boundaries to obtain private details. Associated Newspapers has denied all wrongdoing. Vigorously, publicly, repeatedly, and legally, that's where things stand. Allegation versus denial, awaiting judgment. But this case was never just about evidence. It's about narrative. Harry has framed this legal fight as something close to a moral mission. A reckoning with a press culture he believes destroyed his mother, hounded his family, and continues to profit from intrusion. In interviews, in statements, in past testimony, he has returned to this idea again and again, that someone has to push back. And he wants that someone to be him. There's a certain symmetry to it. The prince who walked away from the institution, now standing alone in court, confronting another powerful institution, armed not with a title, but with a claim form. But symmetry can be deceptive, because courtrooms don't just expose defendants. They expose claimants too. Every word is weighed, every pause noted, every contradiction, however small, preserved in transcripts that don't forget. Observers in the courtroom that week described an atmosphere that was serious but restrained. No theatrics, no explosions. Harry appeared focused, professional, at times almost detached. He answered questions carefully, sometimes slowly, as if choosing not just the right words, but the safest ones. That, in itself, wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the undercurrent, a tension that didn't seem to come from the opposing counsel, or even from the press benches. It felt internal, as if the pressure wasn't coming from across the room, but from somewhere closer, somewhere unseen. At one point, during a procedural exchange that should have passed without comment, Harry hesitated. Just for a second. Not long enough to interrupt the flow, but long enough to be noticed by people trained to notice such things. His jaw tightened. His gaze dropped, then lifted again. Was it nerves? Fatigue? Frustration? Maybe. But here's where context becomes important. Harry has been in court before. He's testified. He's faced hostile questioning. He knows the choreography. He knows how to perform calm. This wasn't his first encounter with legal pressure. And yet, something about this appearance felt heavier. Part of that weight comes from timing. This case is unfolding against a backdrop of unresolved family tensions, ongoing security disputes, and a public identity that remains in flux. Harry is no longer a working royal, but he is not a private citizen in any ordinary sense either. Every move is scrutinized, every absence interpreted. And this lawsuit, while framed as a fight against press misconduct, also forces uncomfortable questions about boundaries, about privacy, about who gets to define intrusion and when. Because there's an irony embedded right at the heart of the claim. Harry argues that journalists violated his privacy by accessing information they had no right to, that they crossed lines, that they abused power. And yet, the institution he was born into has always relied on surveillance, documentation, and record-keeping as a form of control. Not maliciously, perhaps, but systematically. Palaces run on logs, on protocols, on knowing who is where and when. That contradiction wasn't addressed in court. It didn't need to be. Not yet. But it was there. And it lingered. Outside the courtroom, coverage followed predictable lines. Headlines focused on legal arguments, on denials, on the broader implications for British journalism if Harry were to succeed. Commentators debated press freedom versus personal privacy. Old wounds were reopened. Familiar sides were taken. But behind the scenes, attention was shifting elsewhere. Because this visit to London wasn't just about court appearances. It involved logistics, security arrangements, accommodation decisions, movements that had to be coordinated quietly but precisely. And those movements, according to multiple sources, raised eyebrows. Harry did not stay in a publicly disclosed location. Understandable, given security concerns. His schedule was tight, controlled, and deliberately opaque. Again, not unusual for someone in his position. What was unusual was a gap. A small one. Easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. A period of time after one of the court sessions where his whereabouts were not immediately clear, even to people who usually have clarity on such things. At first, it was dismissed as nothing. A private meeting. A delay. Traffic. These things happen. But then questions began to circulate internally. Was he expected at that location? Had clearance been requested? Who signed off? In institutions like the Palace, questions are rarely asked unless something doesn't align with protocol. Curiosity is not encouraged. Precision is. And when precision slips, people notice. It's important to stress this. No one has alleged that Harry broke the law. No one has suggested he forced entry or defied security. That's not the story. The story is perception. Perception of movement without announcement. Perception of access without visibility. Perception of a presence that wasn't supposed to attract attention, but did. And here's where things start to get delicate. Because even asking these questions touches on a raw nerve. Harry's relationship with the institution is unresolved. He left, but he didn't disappear. He criticized it, but he remains bound to it by blood, history, and public fascination. So when someone like Harry moves in proximity to palace space, the meaning is never neutral. Is it personal? Is it symbolic? Is it strategic? No one, at this stage, was willing to say. What they were willing to say quietly is that certain systems recorded more than expected. Security cameras don't care about narratives. They don't care about intent. They record what passes in front of them, indifferent to context. And if footage exists, again, we're being careful, it exists whether anyone likes it or not. Which brings us back to the lawsuit. Because while Harry was challenging the press for allegedly gathering information without consent, the possibility was emerging that information about him was being gathered by another powerful entity, one he knows intimately. That parallel didn't escape notice among legal observers. If this case proceeds, questions of surveillance, consent, and expectation of privacy will be dissected in detail. And while the focus is on media practices, the broader cultural question looms. Who gets to watch whom, and under what justification? The press? The palace? Or no one at all? For now, those questions remain unanswered. What is clear is that the lawsuit served as a catalyst. It brought Harry back into proximity with a system he has publicly criticized but privately understands better than almost anyone. It placed him physically and symbolically within reach of mechanisms that operate on memory, record, and control. And if the timing of subsequent events feels too precise to be coincidence, that's because institutions rarely move accidentally. They respond, sometimes subtly, sometimes silently, and sometimes with reminders. As the court proceedings continued, and as public attention remained fixed on legal arguments and press ethics, something else was unfolding in parallel. Something not meant for headlines, but impossible to ignore once you know where to look. Because the lawsuit didn't just reopen old grievances with the media. It reopened questions about access, authority, and what happens when someone who once lived inside a system returns to challenge it from the outside. And if you're wondering whether that system was prepared for such a challenge, the answer may lie not in court transcripts, but in what was captured after hours, and what someone decided to do with it. Did you notice how quiet the courtroom was when he walked in? Not silent. Just restrained. The kind of hush that isn't imposed by rules, but by anticipation. People sat straighter. Pens paused midair. Even the habitual shuffling that fills most courtrooms seemed to hesitate, as if the room itself was taking a breath. Because whatever this case was on paper, in that moment it became something else. Prince Harry didn't enter as a defiant rebel or a humbled exile. He entered as someone intensely aware of being watched. Not in the theatrical sense, but in the way people are watched when the observers are measuring more than appearances. Measuring control, measuring credibility, measuring whether the story being told aligns with the person telling it. This was not a courtroom hungry for drama. It was a courtroom waiting for tells. And that's where the tension began. From the outside, the proceedings looked almost dull. Legal teams exchanging procedural points. Judges steering conversations back to relevance. Arguments framed in careful, technical language designed to strip emotion out of events that were, at their core, deeply emotional. Harry sat through it all with. This is the thing about courtrooms, they flatten everything. Trauma becomes testimony. Rage becomes evidence. Memory becomes something to be challenged, reframed, or dismissed. Harry knows this. He's spoken before about how alienating that process feels, how stories that are lived get reduced to paragraphs and footnotes. And yet, he chose to be here again, to submit himself once more to a system that does not protect feelings, only facts. At least, facts as they can be proven. What struck some observers was not what Harry said, but how carefully he didn't say certain things. There were moments when a broader narrative could have been offered, moments when he could have leaned into personal history, into emotion, into the story he has told so often in interviews. He didn't. Instead, he answered narrowly. Precisely. Sometimes frustratingly so. Why? Because this case is fragile. Allegations of unlawful information gathering are notoriously difficult to prove, especially years after the fact. Much depends on inference, patterns, and circumstantial evidence. A misstep in tone, a stray comment, an emotional overreach. Any of it could be seized upon to undermine credibility. Harry appeared acutely aware of that. And yet, despite the discipline, there were cracks. Small ones. Fleeting. Easy to miss unless you were watching for them. A pause that lasted a beat too long before answering a routine question. A breath drawn sharply, then controlled. A brief tightening around the eyes when certain media practices were described in abstract terms. These weren't outbursts. They were microreactions. The kind that suggests someone is not just recalling events, but reliving them, and actively choosing how much of that experience to reveal. Here's something worth asking. When someone is fighting for truth, how much truth is too much? Harry's legal team framed the case as part of a broader reckoning with press behavior. They spoke of systemic practices, of cultures that normalized intrusion. They argued that this was not about a single rogue journalist, but about structures that allowed, even encouraged, ethical boundaries to blur. Associated Newspapers representatives pushed back firmly. They emphasized denials. They questioned evidence. They framed the claims as speculative, unsupported, and unfairly generalized. From a legal standpoint, this is how such battles are fought. But beneath the legal choreography, another dynamic was playing out. Harry was being positioned, by both sides, in different ways, as a symbol. To his supporters, he represents resistance. Someone finally pushing back against a press that has operated with impunity for too long. To his critics, he represents hypocrisy. A man who demands privacy while trading in personal revelations when it suits him. The courtroom doesn't resolve that contradiction. It amplifies it. And Harry, sitting there, seemed aware of that amplification. There was a moment, not recorded in transcripts, but described by more than one person present, when a reference was made to historical reporting methods. Not directly about him, just a general acknowledgement of how information was gathered in earlier decades. Harry shifted slightly in his seat. It was subtle, but it was noticed. Because for him, those methods are not historical abstractions. They are tied to personal loss, to anger, to a narrative he has returned to again and again. That unchecked media intrusion has consequences far beyond headlines. Yet here he was, constrained by the very system he had chosen to engage. This is the paradox of litigation. You seek accountability, but you surrender control. You tell your story, but only in pieces. You demand truth, but only the kind that can survive cross-examination. And throughout the proceedings, Harry walked that line carefully. So carefully that some began to wonder what else he was managing. Because courtroom tension usually has a clear source. The opposing side, the stakes, the unpredictability of judgment. But this tension felt layered, as if the case itself was only one strand of pressure. Outside the courtroom, the world carried on. Reporters filed copy. Commentators debated implications. Social media reacted in familiar patterns, sympathy here, skepticism there. Inside, the mood remained controlled. Until it didn't. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make headlines, but enough. There was a point late in one session where the discussion turned briefly to timelines, when certain information might have been obtained, when it might have been published, when the claimant became aware of it. Timelines matter in law. They establish causality, responsibility, limitation periods. They also matter in stories. And as the judge pressed for clarity, Harry hesitated again. Just a fraction. Enough for his legal team to glance toward him, then back to the bench. He answered. The moment passed, but something about it lingered. Because timing, in this entire saga, is everything. Why this lawsuit now? Why this visit now? Why these proceedings unfolding alongside unresolved family tensions and security disputes? Harry has said before that he feels the press exploits timing, releasing stories at moments of maximum vulnerability. Births, deaths, anniversaries. Is it possible he was now acutely aware of timing working against him? Because while he was focused on the legal battle at hand, other clocks were ticking. And that's where the courtroom begins to feel less like a place of resolution and more like a pressure chamber. Every statement is on record, every movement observed, every absence noted. Harry's calm demeanor may have reassured his legal team, but it didn't dispel the sense that something else was unfolding just beyond the courtroom doors. People close to the proceedings noticed that Harry did not linger afterward. No casual conversations, no visible relief. He left with purpose, flanked by security, eyes forward. That, too, was noted. Was he eager to leave, or eager to get somewhere else? At this stage, no one could say. What they could say is that the controlled environment of the courtroom did not seem to ease the tension he carried. If anything, it sharpened it, as if being forced to narrate one version of events had made him more conscious of another version playing out in parallel. And if you think that sounds paranoid, consider this. People who have lived their lives under constant scrutiny develop a heightened sensitivity to being watched, to being recorded, to having movements interpreted. Harry has lived like that since birth. So when he walked out of the high court that day, he did so as someone acutely aware that narratives were being formed. Some he could influence, others he could not. The legal battle with the press was visible, public, argued in daylight. But there was another arena, quieter, less forgiving, where perception mattered just as much, and where records were kept not for publication, but for control. And if the courtroom was about confronting past surveillance, what came next would force Harry to confront the possibility of present observation. Because as the doors closed behind him and the legal teams dispersed, the question was no longer just what had been said under oath. It was where he went next, and whether that movement was being documented in ways he did not anticipate. So let's talk about the part of the day no one was supposed to notice. Because if courtrooms are designed to flatten emotion and regulate movement, everything that happens outside them operates in a very different register. Less formal, less visible, and, paradoxically, far more revealing. After the session ended, the press followed the familiar choreography. Cameras tracked departures. Reporters compared notes. Security ushered people along predetermined routes. To most observers, the story paused there, waiting for the next court date. But stories like this don't pause. They drift. And on that afternoon, the drift mattered. What happened next wasn't dramatic. No sprinting vehicles. No raised voices. No visible confrontation. In fact, the absence of spectacle is precisely why it went unnoticed at first. Until it didn't. There was a gap. Not a long one. Minutes, perhaps. Long enough to be accounted for by traffic or protocol adjustments. Short enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. Except this wasn't an ordinary itinerary. Harry's movements in London are planned with a level of care that borders on obsession. Security concerns alone demand it. Routes are checked. Locations cleared. Schedules shared with a very small circle of people who need to know, and no one else. So when someone inside that circle noticed a discrepancy, it stood out. Where, exactly, was he going? At first, the assumption was benign. A private meeting. A secure residence. Somewhere discreet but expected. That's how these things usually go. But as time passed, and as confirmations didn't come as quickly as they should have, questions began to surface. And in places like the palace, whether spoken aloud or not, questions are currency. It's worth pausing here to clarify something. When people talk about the palace, they often imagine a single, monolithic entity. In reality, it's a network. Departments. Offices. Layers of authority that don't always communicate perfectly, but operate under shared assumptions about order and protocol. One of those assumptions is predictability. You don't move through palace-adjacent spaces casually. You don't appear without notice. You don't improvise. Which is why, when internal checks suggested that Harry's presence overlapped with palace grounds in an unexpected way, the reaction wasn't panic, it was recalibration. Did we miss something? Was there an arrangement we weren't briefed on? Who approved this? These are not accusatory questions. They're procedural, and procedure is how institutions protect themselves from chaos. Here's the thing that complicates matters. Harry is not a stranger to these systems. He grew up inside them. He understands how they work, what they value, and how much they rely on invisibility to function smoothly, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. If he was present in a way that disrupted expectations, it wasn't because he didn't know better. It was because something had changed. Accounts from palace-adjacent sources describe a brief window of confusion. Not alarm, not outrage, just a recalculation of assumptions. Was he supposed to be there? If so, why wasn't this logged through the usual channels? If not, who authorized access? These questions matter not because of what they accuse, but because of what they reveal. That access, in this world, is never neutral. It signals relationships. It implies permissions. It suggests alignment, or the lack of it. And then there is the space itself. When people say palace, they often mean different things. Public rooms, private apartments, offices, corridors that exist almost entirely outside public imagination. Places where staff move freely, but visitors do not. Being seen there, or believed to be seen there, carries weight. Which brings us to the most sensitive element of this chapter: surveillance. This is not the cinematic kind. No shadowy figures watching banks of screens in a dark room. It's more mundane than that. Cameras placed for security, insurance, and record-keeping. They run continuously. They don't editorialize. They don't forget. And they don't care who you are. If someone passes through their field of vision, it's recorded. What happens to that recording is another matter entirely. According to several accounts, footage from that period was reviewed internally. Again, this isn't extraordinary. When there's any discrepancy in movement or access, records are checked. It's how institutions confirm reality. What is extraordinary is what is alleged to have happened next. That the footage did not remain purely internal. Now, to be very clear, there has been no official confirmation of this. No public acknowledgement. No statement issued. Everything that follows exists in the space between corroborated fact and consistent testimony. But consistency matters. Multiple sources, independent of one another, describe the same sequence: review, discussion, decision. A decision not to suppress, but to circulate. Not to leak, in the tabloid sense. Not to embarrass publicly, but to ensure awareness. Awareness of what? Of presence. Of movement. Of visibility. If that sounds vague, that's because it is. Deliberately so. Institutions like the monarchy rarely communicate directly when they can communicate structurally. Through signals. Through reminders. Through actions that don't require explanation to be understood. And if you've lived inside such an institution, you recognize those signals immediately. This is where accounts of Harry's reaction become relevant. People who encountered him later that day describe a visible shift. Not rage in the explosive sense, but something tighter, more contained. A flush across the face. A jaw set hard enough to be noticed. Anger, yes, but not surprise. That detail matters. Because surprise would suggest ignorance. Anger suggests recognition. If Harry became aware that footage existed, and again, we are careful here, then the anger likely wasn't about being seen. It was about what being seen meant. It meant boundaries had not dissolved simply because he stepped away from official duties. It meant that proximity still triggered protocol. It meant that the institution he has criticized publicly still retained the ability to observe, record, and remind. And that reminder came at a moment of acute vulnerability. He was in the UK to challenge the press for invading his privacy. The symmetry is almost cruel. A man standing in court arguing that his private life was unlawfully scrutinized. Confronted, outside court, with evidence that his movements were under scrutiny too. Not by journalists, by the institution that raised him. This is where the narrative stops being simple. It would be easy to frame this as retaliation, or intimidation, or a power play. But that assumes intent we cannot prove. Another interpretation is more unsettling, that this was not about punishment at all. It was about control. Institutions don't need to shout to assert control. They just need to demonstrate capacity, to show, quietly, that they are aware, that they see, that they remember. And for someone like Harry, someone who has built much of his public identity around resisting that kind of surveillance, the psychological impact would be immediate. You can walk away from a role. You can criticize a system, but you can't unlearn how that system works. There is also the question of who, exactly, would have been involved in any decision to circulate such footage. That's where speculation becomes particularly dangerous and particularly tempting. Names are not spoken. They don't need to be. In an institution structured around deference and hierarchy, decisions often move upward without ever being formally articulated. Silence can be approval. Inaction can be endorsement. Which brings us, inevitably, to Buckingham Palace itself. Not the building as tourists see it, but the organism it represents. An entity that survives by appearing timeless, while adapting constantly behind the scenes. The palace does not engage in public disputes. It rarely explains itself. It prefers to let narratives exhaust themselves while it remains still. So if something like this did occur, the absence of comment would be entirely consistent. What wouldn't be consistent is chaos. And yet, chaos is exactly what this moment threatens. Because once you introduce the idea that footage exists, that movement can be documented and shared, you destabilize the carefully maintained boundary between public duty and private autonomy. Harry has argued that the press has failed to respect that boundary. But what happens when the boundary is enforced from within? What happens when the line between protection and surveillance blurs? These are not questions the palace wants asked publicly, nor one's suspects. Are they questions Harry wants to confront while his legal case is still unfolding? Which may explain the silence. No public denial. No confirmation. No clarification. Just tension. And that tension has a way of surfacing in unexpected places. Because while Harry was managing the immediate emotional fallout, the realization that his movements were not as private as he might have assumed, others were thinking ahead. If this footage exists, what else exists? Logs, records, archives. Institutions don't forget. They accumulate. And if one reminder was enough to provoke visible anger, the prospect of more reminders raises the stakes considerably. This is where the story tilts forward. Because what began as a legal challenge to media practices is now entangled with questions of access, authority, and observation that extend far beyond one lawsuit. Harry didn't just return to Britain to confront the press. He returned to a landscape where every step carries meaning, and where meaning is recorded, whether you like it or not. And if the release of that footage was intended as a signal, the signal has been received. The question now is how Harry responds. Does he push forward, treating this as irrelevant noise? Does he recalibrate, adjusting his movements and messaging? Or does he confront the institution itself, quietly, carefully, and on his own terms? Because if more documentation exists, and if more reminders are possible, then this story is no longer about a single visit or a single video. It's about leverage. And leverage, once revealed, rarely stays hidden for long. So here's the uncomfortable pivot point. What happens when the institution that taught you how to survive scrutiny reminds you, quietly, that it still holds the mirrors? Because up to this moment, everything could still be framed as coincidence. A scheduling gap, a procedural review, internal curiosity, nothing more. That's the line many were hoping would hold. But it didn't. Not because of what was said publicly, because of what wasn't said at all. After that afternoon, there was a subtle but measurable shift in posture. Not just from Harry, but from the people around him. Security became tighter, yes, but also more inward-facing. Conversations shortened. Decisions that might normally be delegated suddenly required confirmation. The atmosphere changed in a way that's difficult to quantify unless you've seen it before. It's the difference between routine caution and alertness. And if you've ever worked near power, real institutional power, you know the feeling. When something has happened, but no one is acknowledging it yet. When everyone is waiting to see who moves first. This is where the story stops being about a single moment and starts being about reactions. Because reactions reveal priorities. One of the first things that stood out was how carefully the palace avoided doing anything that could be interpreted as escalation. No statements, no leaks, no briefings on background. Even friendly commentators were left without guidance. That silence was not accidental. Silence, in this context, serves two purposes. It denies oxygen to speculation, and it places the burden of interpretation elsewhere. On Harry, on the press, on the public, and Harry, for his part, did something equally telling. He said nothing. No off-the-cuff remarks. No anonymous sources pushing back. No corrective narrative seeded into sympathetic outlets. Given his history, that restraint is notable. Because Harry is not usually silent when he believes something is unjust. So why now? Part of the risk of legal exposure, risk of institutional retaliation, risk of being frozen out. Which raises a question that sits uncomfortably alongside Harry's lawsuit. If journalists are afraid to pursue certain stories because of institutional pressure, how does that square with claims of unchecked media power? This isn't a defense of the press. It's a recognition that power is rarely one-directional. The monarchy does not sue newspapers. It doesn't need to. Its influence operates through subtler channels. Tradition, access, proximity, the promise of future cooperation, or its withdrawal. Harry understands this. He grew up watching how narratives were shaped not just by what was published, but by what never made it to print. And now, he was on the receiving end of that same dynamic. This is where irony sharpens into something almost painful. Harry has spent years accusing the British press of operating without accountability, of abusing power behind the shield of public interest. Yet here he was, confronting a different kind of power, one that doesn't publish, doesn't argue, and doesn't explain. It just observes. And if you think that's an exaggeration, consider this. Institutions like the palace don't need to release footage publicly to assert dominance. They only need to ensure that the subject knows it exists. Knowledge is leverage. So when Harry reportedly became aware, through intermediaries, through tone shifts, through carefully chosen words, that documentation of his movements had circulated, the message was clear enough. You are still visible. You are still within range. You do not control every narrative. That realization would shake anyone, especially someone whose public mission has been to wrest control back. Now, there's a temptation here to frame this as a confrontation between father and son, to personalize it, to imagine private emotions driving public actions. That's too simple. This is not about familial spite. It's about institutional memory. King Charles III, whether personally involved or not, presides over a system that prioritizes stability above all else. Stability requires predictability. It requires boundaries. Harry's presence, his lawsuit, his proximity, his unpredictable relationship with the institution introduces instability. Institutions respond to instability by tightening controls. Not dramatically, incrementally. And those controls don't need to be justified to the public. They only need to be effective. So where does that leave Harry? In a precarious position. He cannot publicly accuse the palace of surveilling him without undermining his legal case against the press. Doing so would muddy the waters, inviting questions about whether he selectively objects to intrusion. He cannot confront the institution directly without escalating a conflict he has spent years trying to manage on his own terms. And he cannot pretend nothing happened. Not if the emotional reaction described by witnesses is accurate. That leaves silence. Strategic silence. But silence has consequences too. Because while Harry recalibrates, others are drawing conclusions. Legal observers are quietly noting the parallels between his claims and his experience. Media analysts are reassessing assumptions about who holds power in these narratives. Palace insiders are watching to see whether this moment passes or whether it becomes a turning point. And the public? The public senses something is off, even if they can't articulate why. This is how trust erodes. Not through scandal, but through dissonance. Harry says he wants accountability. The palace demonstrates control. The press hesitates. No one is speaking, but everyone is communicating. And that brings us to the next, more dangerous question. If this footage exists, and if its circulation was deliberate, what guarantees are there that it remains contained? Institutions are disciplined, but they are not infallible. People talk. Systems leak. Archives get accessed. What happens if documentation meant as an internal reminder becomes external evidence? What happens if the very mechanisms that reminded Harry of his visibility are exposed to public scrutiny? That's when this story stops being manageable, because then it's not about one prince, one lawsuit, or one quiet reminder. It's about whether an institution that demands discretion can withstand being seen doing what it has always done, just without the veil. And if that veil slips, even slightly, the consequences won't be limited to Harry. They'll ripple outward, touching the press, the courts, and the fragile understanding that keeps all three in uneasy balance. We're not there yet, but the conditions are forming. And as this silence stretches on, the tension doesn't dissipate. It concentrates. Because in stories like this, the most dangerous moments aren't the ones that make headlines. They're the ones everyone agrees not to talk about, until someone does. So here's where the story tightens. Because once silence becomes the chosen strategy, everything else gets louder. Not in headlines, not in statements, but in the small, telling adjustments that signal unease. The first thing people noticed was how information stopped moving. Normally, during a high-profile legal visit like this, there's a rhythm. Briefings don't have to be official to be informative. Someone familiar with the matter will clarify a detail. A source close to the situation will gently redirect speculation. It's not manipulation so much as maintenance, a way of keeping the narrative from drifting too far from what the institution can tolerate. This time, that rhythm broke. Questions went unanswered. Messages weren't returned. Even the usual soft corrections failed to materialize. It wasn't hostility. It was withdrawal. And withdrawal, in this context, is rarely accidental. Because when institutions pull back, it's often because they're deciding what not to say and to whom. Inside palace-adjacent circles, the recalibration continued. Access points were reviewed. Movement protocols were tightened. None of this was visible to the public, but it was felt by those who work within these systems every day. The tone shifted from routine to cautious. Not because something had gone wrong, but because something had been acknowledged. That distinction matters. When something goes wrong, institutions react. When something is acknowledged, they adjust. An adjustment suggests intent. This is also where the emotional temperature around Harry's presence changed. People who encountered him during the days that followed described a man who was more distant, more inwardly focused. Not shaken. That would imply vulnerability. More like someone reassessing the boundaries of a space he thought he understood. If you've ever returned to a place that shaped you, only to realize it no longer sees you the same way, you'll recognize the feeling. You're familiar, but no longer comfortable. Recognized, but no longer accommodated. Harry has spoken publicly about the pain of that realization before, particularly in the context of his family. But this was different. This wasn't emotional estrangement. It was procedural. And procedural exclusion cuts differently, because it doesn't argue with you. It doesn't explain itself. It just operates. At this point, the press began to sense that their usual tools weren't working. Reporters tried to piece together timelines. They compared notes. They looked for confirmation from sources who would normally offer a nudge in one direction or another. Nothing. This created an unusual vacuum. In that vacuum, speculation thrives, but only up to a point. British royal reporting is governed by an unspoken understanding. You don't go too far without something solid. And when the institution closes ranks, solidity becomes hard to find. So instead of stories, there were questions. Quiet ones. Why was Harry's movement suddenly so restricted? Why were certain engagements quietly dropped? Why did palace sources, usually so practiced at informal reassurance, suddenly have no reassurance to give? And then there was the matter of the footage itself. No one had seen it publicly. No screenshots. No leaks. No corroborating images circulating online. If it existed, it was being handled with extreme care. That, paradoxically, made it more credible. Because truly damaging material is rarely splashed immediately. It's preserved, guarded, used sparingly, which leads to the next uncomfortable realization. If the footage was circulated internally or semi-internally, that means it was deemed appropriate for some eyes, but not others. Who decides that? In an institution like the monarchy, decisions rarely come with signatures. They emerge through consensus, hierarchy, and precedent. People understand what is acceptable without being told explicitly. That's how stability is maintained. So if this material moved, it moved with tacit approval. And tacit approval is often more powerful than explicit orders. This is where King Charles III becomes relevant again, not as a character in a drama, but as the figure under whose reign these decisions occur. It's important to be precise here. There is no evidence that the king personally intervened. No proof that he reviewed footage or instructed anyone to circulate it. That kind of direct involvement would be highly unusual. But monarchies don't operate on direct involvement alone. They operate on culture, on what is considered permissible, on what aligns with institutional priorities, on what preserves authority. And authority, in moments like this, is less about asserting dominance and more about reinforcing boundaries. Harry's lawsuit challenges one boundary: how far the press can go. The palace's response, if the accounts are accurate, reinforces another: how far autonomy extends once you leave the role, but not the lineage. This is not revenge. It's not even confrontation in the traditional sense. It's calibration. And calibration can be deeply unsettling for someone who has tried to redraw the map. Harry's public narrative has been built on the idea of stepping away, of reclaiming agency, of choosing a life less constrained by rigid protocols and silent expectations. But proximity changes everything. When he returned to London, he wasn't just entering a legal arena. He was re-entering a symbolic space where old rules still echo, even if they're no longer enforced in the same way. That echo is what this alleged footage represents. Not exposure, recognition. And recognition, when unwanted, can feel like surveillance. This is where the emotional contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Harry is fighting a system he believes violated his privacy. At the same time, he is confronted with evidence, implicit or otherwise, that privacy has always been conditional in his world. Conditional on role, conditional on compliance, conditional on distance. Step too close, and the conditions reassert themselves. This contradiction doesn't weaken his case legally, at least not directly, but it complicates it morally. It introduces ambiguity into a narrative that depends on clarity. And ambiguity is dangerous in long-form public battles. Because ambiguity invites interpretation. Some will see Harry as a victim of overlapping power structures, press and palace alike, each exerting control in different ways. Others will see him as someone who demands exceptions without fully acknowledging the systems he benefits from. Neither interpretation is clean, and that's the problem. The longer this remains unresolved, the more space there is for narratives to fracture. Meanwhile, the legal case continues. Arguments are made. Documents are filed. Timelines are debated. On the surface, nothing has changed. But beneath that surface, something has shifted. Legal observers note that Harry's team has become even more cautious. Language is scrutinized. Public appearances are minimized. The margin for error has narrowed. Why? Because when multiple powerful systems are in play, missteps compound. A comment meant to criticize the press could be read as an indictment of institutional surveillance more broadly. A gesture intended to signal independence could be interpreted as defiance. And defiance, in this context, would be a mistake. Not because the palace would retaliate openly, it wouldn't, but because it would prompt further tightening. More control, more documentation, more reminders. This is the trap of institutional power. The more you push against it directly, the more it asserts itself indirectly. Harry knows this. He has lived it, which may explain why his response has been so restrained. No accusations, no counterleaks, no dramatic exits, just recalibration. But recalibration has limits, because silence, if prolonged, starts to look like acquiescence. And acquiescence undermines the very stance Harry has taken against unchecked power. This is where the stakes rise again. If Harry says nothing, he risks allowing a quiet precedent to form, one where his movements can be monitored and signaled without challenge. If he speaks, he risks destabilizing his legal case and escalating a conflict he may not be able to control. It's a narrow path, and the press, watching from the sidelines, senses it. Some journalists have begun to ask a different set of questions, not about the footage itself, but about what its existence implies. If such material can be circulated internally, what safeguards exist? Who decides when documentation becomes leverage? And how does that square with public claims of restraint and neutrality? These questions haven't made it into print yet, but they're being discussed. Quietly, carefully, because once these questions are asked publicly, they don't stay contained. They force comparisons. They invite scrutiny. They pull the veil back, just a little. And institutions depend on the veil. So here we are. Harry, standing at the intersection of two battles, one legal, one symbolic. Each shaping the other in ways that are increasingly difficult to separate. The palace, maintaining silence, reinforcing boundaries without explanation. The press, cautious, alert, waiting for something solid enough to pursue. And the public, sensing that something important is happening just out of view. This is the phase of the story where nothing explodes. Instead, pressure builds. Because if more documentation exists, and logic suggests it does, then the question is no longer whether it will matter. It's when. And who will decide that moment? Will it be used again as a quiet reminder? Will it leak, unintentionally or otherwise? Or will it remain a shadow presence, shaping behavior without ever being acknowledged? Those answers will determine not just how this lawsuit ends, but how the next chapter of Harry's relationship with the institution unfolds. Because once you realize you're still being watched, you have to decide what to do with that knowledge. And whatever decision Harry makes next, it won't stay private for long. So now we reach the point where intention starts to matter more than evidence. Because once pressure stabilizes, once everyone involved understands the boundaries again, the real question becomes not what happened, but what it was meant to do. And this is where the story turns from observation to interpretation. Up until now, everything can be described as reaction. A lawsuit triggers scrutiny. Scrutiny triggers review. Review triggers internal circulation. Each step defensible in isolation. Each step explainable if you squint just enough. But institutions don't operate only in reaction. They anticipate. They shape outcomes quietly, long before anyone thinks to call it strategy. Which raises the uncomfortable question no one wants to ask out loud. If the alleged circulation of footage wasn't accidental, what was it designed to accomplish? Let's strip away the drama for a moment and think practically. The palace does not need to intimidate Harry. It doesn't need to threaten him, warn him, or publicly contradict him. Those would be blunt instruments, and blunt instruments draw attention. What it does need, what it always needs, is predictability. Predictability of behavior. Predictability of messaging. Predictability of proximity. Harry's return to London disrupted that predictability. Not because he came back. That happens. Not because he went to court. That was expected. But because his presence intersected with multiple unresolved tensions at once. Litigation against the press, ongoing disputes over security, and an unresolved emotional narrative that still captures public imagination. Too many variables. Too much volatility. Institutions don't like volatility. So what do? They reduce it. Not by force. By clarification. And clarification doesn't always come in words. Sometimes it comes in reminders. Reminders of visibility. Reminders of boundaries. Reminders that certain spaces are never neutral. If the footage existed, and if it moved, then its value wasn't in humiliation. It wasn't even in documentation. It was in signaling. Signaling to Harry that proximity still carries conditions. Signaling to staff that protocols still matter. Signaling internally that unpredictability had been noticed and addressed. That's how institutions speak to themselves. And that internal conversation is often more important than any external narrative. Now here's where the situation becomes even more delicate. Because signaling only works if the recipient understands it. And Harry understands institutional language fluently. He grew up in it. He learned it before he learned how to speak to the press. He knows the difference between a warning and a correction, between a snub and a recalibration. So when witnesses describe his reaction not as shock, but as anger, that distinction becomes crucial. Shock would imply surprise. Anger implies comprehension. It suggests he understood exactly what the signal was. And that understanding creates a new layer of tension. Because once you recognize a signal, you have to decide whether to accept it. Acceptance doesn't mean agreement. It means adjustment. An adjustment has already been visible. Harry's movements became tighter. His appearances fewer. His exposure reduced. Not dramatically. Not in a way that draws attention. Just enough to restore equilibrium. From the palace's perspective, this is success. From Harry's perspective, it's a compromise. And compromises are dangerous when they're unspoken. Because they linger. They shape behavior. They create precedents. And precedents have a way of resurfacing later, often at the worst possible moment. This is also where the legal case begins to feel increasingly fragile, not in its merits, but in its framing. Harry's lawsuit against the publisher of the Daily Mail rests on a clear moral claim that powerful entities violated his privacy and should be held accountable. That claim resonates with many people. It aligns with broader concerns about media ethics, data protection, and personal boundaries in an age of surveillance. But if Harry is perceived, fairly or not, as accepting surveillance from one institution while condemning it from another, the clarity of that moral claim begins to blur. Opposing counsel doesn't need to prove hypocrisy. They only need to suggest inconsistency. And inconsistency erodes sympathy. That doesn't mean Harry is wrong. It means the terrain he's operating on has become more complex. Because now, any discussion of privacy inevitably raises questions about expectation. When does Harry expect privacy? Where does he expect it? From whom? In court, those questions are technical. Outside court, they're narrative. And narratives,